9 years ago, I lost my fiancé to my sister, and my family labeled me a bitter loser. Tonight, at a lavish Atlanta dinner, she slid an embossed card toward me, smirking that I should get used to sitting alone. I did not argue. I just checked my watch, because the man about to walk through those doors is not coming to defend me. He is coming to hand my family the exact consequences they signed up for. I am Stella Perry. At 34 years old, I had learned an ugly, fundamental truth about the world. Blood is not necessarily thicker than water, but it is substantially harder to wash out of your clothes when it spills. Tonight, the air inside the private dining area of the Ashbourne Room in Atlanta felt remarkably thick, heavy with the combined scents of roasted duck, expensive vintage wine, and an unfiltered, familiar malice. The restaurant was an institution for the city's elite, a place defined by dim, moody lighting, heavy velvet curtains, and massive crystal chandeliers that cast fractured, sharp shadows across the immaculate white linen tablecloths. It was the absolute perfect stage for a theatrical performance, and my family, the Perrys, were nothing if not dedicated, lifelong actors. My older sister, Laurel, sat directly across the table from me. She was undeniably the star of tonight's show, dressed in a sequined emerald gown that caught the ambient light entirely too aggressively. Her lips were painted a sharp, violent shade of crimson, pulled into a wide smile that did not manage to reach her cold, calculating eyes. Seated beside her was Graham Holloway. He was the man who had once placed a diamond ring on my finger, looked into my eyes to promise me forever, and then vanished into my sister's bed, just days before I was supposed to walk down the aisle. That happened 9 years ago. 9 long, excruciating years since the day my entire world collapsed, leaving me to crawl out of the emotional wreckage entirely on my own while my family watched from a comfortable distance. Tonight was officially labeled a family dinner. That was the phrase my mother, Celeste, had used in her brief formal text message. But sitting here, listening to the sharp clinking of heavy silver cutlery against fine porcelain plates, I knew exactly what this gathering truly was. It was an ambush. It was an unearned victory lap. Laurel reached into her beaded designer clutch and produced a heavy cream-colored envelope. She placed it onto the polished mahogany table and used 2 perfectly manicured fingers to push it slowly, deliberately across the smooth wood until it came to a halt just inches from my crystal water glass. The invitation card inside was thick, edged in real gold leaf, the cursive font embossed so deeply into the paper that I could read the elegant words just by looking at the shadows they cast under the chandelier. It was a dual announcement, a celebration of her grand new business venture and, far more pointedly, an invitation to their lavish 9th wedding anniversary gala. "You simply have to come, Stella," Laurel said. Her voice was much too loud, pitched perfectly to ensure that the waiter pouring water at the adjacent service station, and perhaps even the couple dining in the far corner of the room, caught every single syllable. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, the fake compassion dripping from her tone like thick poison. "I mean, it is about time you stopped hiding from the world. Though, I suppose when you send in your response card, you should just get used to writing down a table for one. We cannot all be lucky enough to have a +1, can we?" The silence that followed her statement was not an awkward one. It was heavy and expectant. I shifted my gaze to our parents. Richard and Celeste Perry sat at the head of the long table, presiding over the meal like royalty holding court. My mother took a delicate, measured sip of her chilled Chardonnay, her eyes sparkling with quiet, undeniable amusement over the rim of the glass. My father let out a low, rumbling chuckle, shaking his head gently as he sliced a piece of his medium-rare steak. They did not raise a hand to reprimand Laurel. They did not utter a single word to defend me. To my parents, my public humiliation was not a tragedy. It was merely a recurring, highly anticipated act of entertainment. It proved their long-held, deeply cherished theory that Laurel was the ultimate winner, the prize child, the one who took exactly what she wanted and thrived, while I was simply the cold, overly ambitious failure who deserved to lose everything I held dear. I did not flinch under their collective gaze. I did not offer them the tears or the visible breakdown they were so desperately fishing for. Graham cleared his throat, adjusting the crisp white cuffs of his tailored suit. He adopted a look of profound, sickening generosity, puffing his chest out slightly. He looked across the table at me with the specific kind of pity usually reserved for wounded animals stranded on the side of a busy highway. "Now, Laurel, be gentle with your sister," Graham murmured, though the arrogant smirk playing on the corners of his lips entirely betrayed his polite words. He turned his attention fully to me, his tone shifting smoothly to that of a magnanimous corporate executive addressing a helpless subordinate. "Seriously, Stella, if you are struggling out there in the real world, you really should let me know. The job market is incredibly tough right now. Brightvale Senior Communities is always expanding our regional offices. I could probably pull a few strings with the higher-ups, arrange a low-level administrative position for you, something simple and stress-free, basic data entry, answering the phones at the front desk, just to help you get back on your feet and secure a steady paycheck. There is absolutely no shame in needing a little charitable handout from your family." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of his offer hung suspended in the chilled air of the dining room. A charitable handout from the very man who had struck the match and burned my life to the ground nearly a decade ago. They sat there and waited for the explosion. They actively wanted me to throw my linen napkin down onto the plate, to scream at the top of my lungs, to storm out of the Ashbourne room in a fit of hysterical rage so they could spend the remainder of the evening shaking their heads, whispering over their expensive desserts about how emotionally unstable and hopelessly bitter I still was after all these years. Instead, I sat perfectly straight against the plush, velvet upholstery of my chair. I took a slow, deeply measured breath, letting the coolness of the air conditioning fill my lungs and steady my racing pulse. I said absolutely nothing. I simply observed them. I have learned that when you completely stop reacting to people, you start truly seeing them. And what I saw sitting across the table tonight was a tragic masterpiece of pure desperation. I looked closely at Laurel. The emerald gown was visually stunning. Yes, but right beneath her left armpit, the delicate fabric seam was slightly strained, and a tiny, frayed white plastic thread peeked out against her skin. It was the exact, unmistakable remnant of a rental security tag that had been hastily and improperly snipped off right before she left her house. My eyes drifted slowly up to her neck. The massive statement piece resting on her collarbone was catching the light brightly. It was catching the light entirely too brightly. Real diamonds possess a hidden depth, a quiet, mesmerizing fire. These stones possess the harsh, flat, glassy glare of high-grade cubic zirconia. The necklace was trying entirely too hard to convince the surrounding world that it was priceless. I shifted my attention to Graham. He wore a heavy luxury watch on his left wrist, but the brown leather strap was worn incredibly thin and discolored at the buckle. It was a clear sign he wore the exact same timepiece every single day, unable to afford a rotation of accessories. His posture was unnaturally stiff, his smile tight and forced. This was not the relaxed, easy confidence of a wildly successful corporate titan. This was the rigid, terrifying paranoia of a man frantically treading water in the middle of a violent storm. My parents, utterly blinded by their desperate, lifelong need for social status and validation, saw only the shimmering, golden surface. I saw the extensive rot underneath the floorboards. This entire dinner, the gold-plated invitations, the arrogant speeches, the expensive wine, it was all a carefully constructed illusion. A frantic, over-the-top display from a family absolutely terrified that someone, somewhere, might discover they were not actually winning the game. Laurel, clearly irritated by my complete lack of visible devastation, decided she needed to push the knife in a little harder. She reached out and wrapped her hand possessively around Graham's arm, leaning her body into his shoulder. "We are pulling out all the stops for the anniversary gala," Laurel boasted, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls, her eyes locking onto mine, aggressively demanding a display of jealousy. We are hosting the entire event on the rooftop of Perry Landing. The catering budget alone is costing us tens of thousands of dollars. It is going to be the social event of the season in Atlanta. Mommy and Daddy were so incredibly generous to let us use the family building. It is the absolute perfect, glamorous backdrop for my new lifestyle brand launch. A true legacy property for a legacy brand. Perry Landing. The historic, multi-story commercial building downtown that had belonged to our late grandmother. It was the sole piece of real, tangible, income-producing wealth left attached to the Perry family name. I reached out and picked up my water glass. The condensation felt soothingly cool against my fingertips. I took a slow sip, swallowed quietly, and gently placed the heavy crystal back onto the leather coaster. I looked directly into Laurel's eyes, holding her gaze for a long moment before I shifted my attention to Graham. The rooftop of Perry Landing, I repeated. My voice was completely even, entirely devoid of any anger or inflection. It was so quiet that they were forced to lean in slightly across the table just to hear my words. That sounds incredibly ambitious. Tell me, are all the papers for that building completely finalized? It was a seemingly innocuous question, a polite, standard inquiry about the logistical realities of hosting a massive event at a commercial property. But the physical reaction across the table was instantaneous and undeniable. Graham's right hand, which had been resting casually beside his plate, twitched violently, his fingers curled inward toward his palm. His jaw clenched tight, and for a fraction of a second, the smug, arrogant mask completely slipped from his face, revealing a flash of absolute, unadulterated panic. He blinked twice, rapidly, and suddenly found the intricate floral pattern etched into his silver butter knife utterly fascinating. He did not say a word. He did not answer the question. Laurel frowned deeply, visibly confused by the sudden, dramatic shift in her husband's demeanor. She was entirely unaware of the ground crumbling rapidly beneath her expensive, rented shoes. "Of course the papers are fine," she snapped defensively, her voice shrill. "What kind of a stupid question is that? You always try to ruin the mood with your boring legal obsessions." My parents exchanged a brief, highly annoyed glance, clearly preparing to scold me for souring the celebratory mood of the evening. I did not engage with Laurel's defensive outburst. I did not press Graham to provide an answer that I already knew he could not give. The slight, panicked falter in his breathing was all the confirmation I required to know that the trap was set. I simply pulled back the sleeve of my silk blouse and calmly looked down at my watch. It was nearing 8 o'clock in the evening. "Just asking," I murmured softly. I let my hands rest gracefully in my lap, feeling the steady, powerful, rhythmic pulse of my own heartbeat. Laurel could have her cheap insults and her rented dresses. My parents could have their cruel laughter and their empty social climbing. Graham could have his fragile, fabricated pride and his fake job titles. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to defend myself against the ghosts of a betrayal from 9 years ago. I just had to wait, because the time for petty, childish family squabbles was officially over. I was simply counting down the minutes, staring at the heavy wooden door of the private room, waiting for a force much larger and far more destructive than this suffocating dining room to arrive. At 25 years old, I operated under the incredibly naive assumption that loyalty was a guaranteed return on investment. I believed that if you built a foundation with enough dedication, integrity, and hard work, it would hold steady against any storm. I applied this exact philosophy to every single aspect of my life, especially my career and my relationship. Back then, I was a junior project coordinator at Harborline Civic Lab, an urban planning and property restoration firm that specialized in breathing life back into forgotten, crumbling corners of the city. My days and nights were entirely consumed by structural integrity reports, municipal zoning codes, and massive spreadsheets detailing the exact cost of salvaging abandoned historical sites. While my friends were spending their weekends at rooftop bars or weekend getaways, I was sitting at a cluttered desk under fluorescent lights, drinking lukewarm coffee at 2 o'clock in the morning, trying to balance budgets that were hundreds of thousands of dollars in the red. I loved the work. I loved the tangible reality of taking something broken and making it fundamentally sound again. I thought Graham understood this about me. We had been together for 4 solid years. He had always praised my ambition, telling our friends that he admired my relentless drive. When he proposed, I approached our upcoming marriage with the same meticulous organization I used for my restoration projects. I had color-coded binders, strict timelines, and a clear vision of our future. But planning a wedding required a level of constant, performative social energy that I simply did not possess, especially while working 60 hours a week trying to secure municipal grants. That was when Laurel gracefully stepped into the frame. My sister eagerly volunteered to play the role of the ultimate, enthusiastic maid of honor. At first, I was genuinely grateful. When I was trapped in an emergency city council meeting, Laurel was the one who accompanied Graham to the caterer to select the dinner menu. When I was buried under a mountain of environmental impact studies, Laurel went to the florist to ensure the centerpieces matched the exact shade of the bridesmaids' dresses. She was always there, stepping in to fill the gaps my career created. She attended my dress fittings, she organized the venue walkthroughs, and she spent countless evenings sitting on my living room sofa with Graham, laughing over wine while they finalized the seating charts. I was too exhausted and too trusting to see what was actually happening. Laurel was not helping me build my wedding. She was systematically dismantling my boundaries and inserting herself into the empty spaces of my relationship. The Perry family dynamic had always perfectly primed the stage for this kind of subtle usurpation. My parents, Richard and Celeste, had spent our entire lives making it abundantly clear that Laurel was the premium asset of the family portfolio. Laurel was undeniably beautiful, effortlessly charismatic, and possessed a natural talent for making other people feel fiercely devoted to her. She was the daughter my mother proudly paraded at country club luncheons, the one whose social grace elevated the Perry name. I, on the other hand, was the practical, utilitarian daughter. I was reliable, intelligent, and fiercely independent, but I lacked the shimmering, superficial polish that my parents valued above all else. They tolerated my career, but they openly adored Laurel's existence. The illusion of my perfect future shattered exactly 72 hours before I was supposed to walk down the aisle. I had come home from the Harborline office early on a Tuesday afternoon, intending to surprise Graham and spend a quiet evening together before the chaos of the wedding weekend consumed us. The apartment was completely silent. Graham was in the shower, the sound of running water muffled through the bathroom door. His laptop was sitting open on the kitchen island, the screen glowing brightly in the dim afternoon light. I walked over to close it, not wanting the battery to drain. As my hand reached for the screen, a new email notification slid into the top right corner. The sender was Laurel. The subject line was simply a reservation confirmation number for a luxury boutique hotel located 3 hours outside the city. The preview text of the message did not say anything about floral arrangements or wedding rehearsals. It read, in agonizingly clear language, that she could not wait until this stupid weekend was finally over, so they would not have to hide from me anymore. I did not scream. I did not throw the laptop against the wall. The betrayal did not hit me like a sudden, violent explosion. Instead, it felt like a heavy, freezing stone had been quietly dropped into the very bottom of my stomach. I stood there in the silent kitchen, staring at the glowing screen, and deliberately opened the email thread. I scrolled down. I read months of correspondence. I read about stolen afternoons in hotel rooms while I was at work. I read inside jokes about my obsessive scheduling. I read Graham telling my sister that he felt suffocated by my ambition and alive when he was with her. They had been sleeping together for almost 6 months. When Graham stepped out of the bathroom, drying his hair with a towel, I handed him the laptop. I did not ask for an explanation, because the words were right there in black and white. He went completely pale, stammering out fractured, pathetic half-sentences about how it meant nothing, how it was just the stress of the wedding, how things had just gotten wildly out of hand. I packed a single suitcase and walked out the door without shedding a single tear in front of him. The true, soul-crushing devastation did not come from losing Graham. It came 3 hours later, when I drove to my parents' sprawling suburban home seeking the unconditional protection that a family is supposed to provide. I walked into their immaculate, sunlit living room and laid the printed copies of the emails onto the expensive glass coffee table. Richard and Celeste read through the undeniable proof of their golden daughter's ultimate betrayal. I stood there, my entire life in ruins, waiting for the outrage. I waited for my mother to hold me. I waited for my father to tell me that everything was going to be all right. Instead, my mother carefully placed the papers back onto the table, smoothing out a tiny crease in the corner of the page. She let out a long, heavy sigh, looking at me not with profound sympathy, but with mild, lingering exhaustion. "Stella, you have to look at this rationally," Celeste said, her voice smooth and unnervingly calm. "You have been so incredibly distant lately. You are always buried in your work, always talking about those depressing construction sites. Graham is a man. He needs a woman who makes him feel important and cherished, not a woman who brings building permits to the dinner table and schedules affection like a dental appointment. You are just too cold." "Darling," I stopped breathing. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely too thin. I looked at my father, silently begging him to intervene, to inject some sanity into the conversation. Richard simply swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass, avoiding my eyes. "Your sister has a much softer touch, Stella," he muttered quietly. "You are too rigid, too fiercely independent. It is a terrible shame it happened this way, but honestly, maybe it is for the best. You two were never a perfect match anyway." At that exact moment, the front door opened, and Laurel walked into the house. She had clearly received a frantic phone call from Graham. She did not look ashamed. She did not rush over to beg for my forgiveness. She walked into the living room, assessed the situation, and crossed her arms over her chest. She looked at me with a serene, almost pitying expression that made my skin crawl. "You cannot legislate matters of the heart, Stella," Laurel said, her voice dripping with artificial philosophical wisdom. "Love is not at fault. We did not plan this to hurt you. It just happened. You just need to learn how to accept reality and move on without making a massive, dramatic scene." There was no apology. There was no accountability. There was only a unified family front, instinctively closing ranks to protect the daughter they preferred, while actively blaming the betrayed daughter for her own destruction. I canceled the wedding the very next morning. I personally called the caterers, the venue, and the florists, losing tens of thousands of dollars in non-refundable deposits. I dismantled the future I had spent years building in a matter of hours. But the narrative that eventually leaked out to our extended relatives and the wealthy family friends was drastically, violently different from the truth. The story my parents carefully and deliberately spun over the next few weeks was a masterpiece of character assassination. They whispered at dinner parties that the immense pressure of the wedding had made me impossible to deal with. They claimed with tragic, sympathetic sighs that I had callously prioritized my career over my relationship, driving poor Graham away. And when Laurel and Graham officially announced they were a couple just a few months later, my parents sold the story that the two of them had simply found innocent comfort in each other during the tragic, messy dissolution of my engagement. That night, sitting alone on the floor of my dark apartment, surrounded by boxes of unused wedding favors and perfectly printed invitations that would never be sent, the dull, aching pain finally settled deep into my bones. It was the night I understood a cruel, undeniable fact. In the Perry household, the actual, factual truth was entirely irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the flawless, curated image they desperately wanted to present to the outside world. And in their beautiful painted portrait of a perfect family, there was absolutely no room for an ugly truth, so they simply erased me from the canvas. I did not waste a single moment mourning a family that had never genuinely wanted me in the first place. Within 4 weeks of walking away from that disastrous confrontation in my parents' living room, I had completely severed my ties. I packed my entire apartment into cardboard boxes, changed my phone number, and quietly stepped out of their toxic orbit. I took the raw, bleeding energy of that profound betrayal and channeled it into a cold, relentless, and absolute focus. I resigned from my position at Harborline Civic Lab. The work there was too idealistic, too soft for the person I was rapidly becoming. I needed an environment that was sharp, unforgiving, and grounded entirely in harsh realities. I found that exact environment at NorthPass Risk Group. NorthPass was an elite financial and structural analysis firm that dealt almost exclusively in corporate disasters. We handled indefinitely stalled commercial real estate projects, massive construction code violations, and highly aggressive corporate debt restructuring. While other glamorous architectural firms were busy designing shiny new glass towers and celebrating groundbreakings, my team was tasked with dissecting the rotting, bankrupt corpses of failed developments. I routinely worked 80 hours a week, burying myself under mountains of complex legal discovery documents, contractor invoices, and highly contested financial audits. That was where I truly learned how to read a corporate ledger. I learned the invaluable lesson that while numbers themselves never actually lie, the desperate people entering them onto the page absolutely do. I developed a razor-sharp instinct for the distinct smell of a fabricated invoice. I trained my brain to scan a 500-page expense report and immediately spot the exact, obscure line item where a corrupt developer had quietly funneled $300,000 meant for structural steel into a private offshore account or a personal vanity project. I quickly became the firm's leading specialist in distressed assets. More specifically, I became the exact person the banks called when a wealthy, arrogant owner had bankrupted a massive project simply to feed their own fragile, overinflated ego. I tore down expensive illusions for a living, and I was incredibly good at it. It was during one of these deeply contentious, high-stakes recovery deals that I first crossed paths with Reed Talbot. The project was a catastrophic failure, a massive, half-finished luxury condominium complex on the edge of the city that had been stalled in brutal litigation for nearly 3 years. I was sitting in a hostile, overheated boardroom filled with screaming, panicked hedge fund investors and slick, aggressive corporate defense lawyers. The air was thick with panic and misplaced blame. Reed was the only person in that entire room sitting perfectly still. He was a former civil engineer who had transitioned into private redevelopment investment. He did not yell over the chaos. He did not engage in the aggressive physical posturing that the other men in the room were relying on. When he finally leaned forward and spoke, his voice was quiet, steady, and devastatingly precise. He pointed out a fundamental, catastrophic flaw in the load-bearing calculations on the third floor that completely negated the entire inflated valuation of the property. He did not need to raise his voice to command the absolute respect of every single person at that table. His authority came from undeniable competence, not volume. We realized very quickly that our minds operated on the exact same intricate wavelength. I saw the hidden, dangerous traps buried deep within the financial architecture. He saw the physical, unyielding realities of the concrete and the steel. We began meeting for coffee to discuss the logistics of the fallout, which eventually turned into late dinners analyzing structural blueprints and bankruptcy filings. Within a year of that initial boardroom meeting, we both left our highly lucrative positions at our respective firms and founded Halcyon Redevelopment Partners together. Our mission at Halcyon was entirely different from the predatory private equity firms that simply bought up distressed properties, fired the staff, and flipped the real estate for a quick, brutal profit. We deliberately purchased heavily entangled, legally paralyzed assets. We stripped away the bloated, corrupt management layers, cleared the massive debts, and completely repurposed the buildings into highly functional, deeply necessary facilities for the local community. We transformed an abandoned, bankrupt luxury athletic club into an affordable, state-of-the-art community health and wellness center. We converted an empty, foreclosed corporate headquarters into a thriving incubator space for small, local businesses. Reed did not look at me and see a damaged, bitter woman who had been left behind by her family. He did not see a cold, unlovable workaholic, which was the narrative my parents had so desperately tried to sell to the world. He looked at me and saw an equal partner with a spine forged from solid titanium and a mind that he frequently described as beautifully, terrifyingly sharp. Our professional partnership seamlessly and naturally evolved into a profound, quiet romance. It was not built on the flashy, empty grand gestures or the performative, highly curated social media posts that my sister relied on to validate her existence. Our relationship was built on a foundation of mutual, unshakable respect, unwavering loyalty, and a shared vision of how to rebuild broken things. 2 years ago, on a rainy Tuesday morning, Reed and I walked into the downtown city courthouse and got married. There were no expensive, towering floral arrangements. There was no 300-person guest list to manage. I did not wear a custom designer dress that cost tens of thousands of dollars. The entire ceremony took exactly 15 minutes. It was just the two of us, standing in front of a judge, making a permanent vow that was actually meant to withstand the test of time. I did not call my parents to tell them the news. I did not send a polite, formal announcement card to my sister. I had learned the hardest, most vital lesson of my entire life. You absolutely do not share the things you consider sacred with people who only know how to corrupt and destroy. But even while I was actively building a beautiful, quiet, and incredibly fulfilling life with Reed, a very small, highly vigilant part of my mind remained permanently fixed on the past. I never stopped watching Perry Landing. Perry Landing was a stunning historic red brick commercial building located right in the heart of the downtown district, originally constructed in the 1920s. More importantly, it had belonged to my maternal grandmother. She was the absolute only person in the entire Perry bloodline who had ever looked at me and seen my inherent value. She was the only one who had never demanded that I perform a specific, shiny role in order to earn her affection. When she passed away, the building transferred into a complex family trust. I knew my parents. I knew Laurel. I thoroughly understood their insatiable, desperate hunger for external validation and their absolute obsession with maintaining the appearance of immense, generational wealth. I knew, with absolute, cold mathematical certainty, that it was only a matter of time before they attempted to leverage my grandmother's legacy to fund one of their empty, glamorous charades. So, years ago, I quietly set up automated digital alerts for every single municipal filing, tax assessment, zoning request, and property lien associated with that specific address. I monitored the public records with the patience of a predator waiting in the tall grass. I went about my life, I built my company, and I loved my husband, all while knowing that eventually, my family's staggering arrogance would vastly outpace the actual funds sitting in their bank accounts. I knew they would eventually make a fatal mistake with that building, and I made a quiet promise to myself that when that day finally came, I would be the one waiting on the other side of the paperwork. To the untrained eye, Laurel House living was an absolute triumph. Over the course of almost a decade, my sister had meticulously curated a lifestyle brand that sold an intoxicating, highly aspirational version of domestic perfection. Her social media feeds were an endless, glossy stream of imported Italian marble countertops, custom velvet upholstery, and perfectly arranged floral centerpieces. She marketed herself as a premier luxury interior designer and a high-end lifestyle influencer. Every single photograph was bathed in warm, golden light, projecting an aura of effortless, old-money sophistication. For Richard and Celeste, this glittering digital empire was the absolute ultimate vindication. They treated Laurel and Graham as living, breathing proof that they had correctly calculated their emotional investments. In their eyes, backing the daughter who possessed the charm and the aesthetic appeal had paid out massive, beautiful dividends. They proudly directed their wealthy country club friends to Laurel's website, boasting about her expanding influence and her exquisite taste. They entirely ignored my existence, perfectly content to bask in the overwhelming, manufactured glow of my sister's supposed success. Graham, for his part, had constructed a parallel, equally hollow corporate kingdom. He loudly and frequently declared himself a vital, indispensable executive at Brightvale Senior Communities, a massive national healthcare conglomerate. At family gatherings and holiday parties events, I was never invited to, but heard about through the relentless, gossiping grapevine of our extended relatives, Graham would hold court with a glass of expensive scotch in his hand. He would casually drop heavy buzzwords about massive quarterly acquisitions, multi-million-dollar budget expansions, and his close, personal relationship with the chief executive officer. He projected the absolute certainty of a man who controlled vast empires from a corner office in the sky. But I was no longer the naive, trusting girl who had been blindsided by a hidden email account. My entire professional existence at Halcyon Redevelopment Partners revolved around identifying the tiny, microscopic fractures in massive, seemingly impenetrable corporate facades. I spent my days hunting down the exact moment when a lie became too expensive to maintain. And when I turned that same clinical, forensic gaze toward my own family, the rotting foundation beneath their glittering castle was almost insultingly obvious. I started paying much closer attention to Laurel's online presence. Where hundreds of thousands of her devoted followers saw a jet-setting, impossibly wealthy entrepreneur, I saw a frantic, highly choreographed production built entirely on shifting sands. She frequently posted glamorous photo shoots, lounging in the expansive, sunlit living rooms of massive estates, or leaning casually against the sleek hoods of exotic European sports cars. But the eye of a distressed asset specialist is rigorously trained to look past the focal point and examine the background. I noticed that the intricately carved wooden baseboards in a supposedly brand-new, exclusive architectural commission were the exact same baseboards from a historic rental property available by the hour on a popular location scouting website. I noticed that the breathtaking, panoramic office views she claimed as her new corporate headquarters featured window mullions that did not match any commercial high-rise in the downtown district. They perfectly matched the windows of a well-known, shared co-working space that rented single desks by the month. The luxurious, impossibly thick cashmere throws and the heavy brass accent pieces constantly migrated from one location to another, serving as traveling, recycled props in a remarkably low-budget play. Then, the actual financial cracks began to show in the public sector. The highly anticipated, heavily promoted seasonal collections for Laurel House Living started experiencing bizarre, unexplained delays. Entire shipments of luxury bedding and hand-poured ceramic vases simply vanished from the official launch calendar. When her frustrated customers flooded her comment sections demanding answers, Laurel smoothly pivoted, filming manicured video updates where she claimed this was a deliberate, highly exclusive scarcity strategy. She insisted she was strictly limiting inventory to preserve the artisanal integrity of her brand. It was a beautiful, elegant lie. I knew exactly what a scarcity strategy looked like, and I also knew what a catastrophic supply chain failure looked like. I routinely dealt with commercial contractors and international manufacturers. Vendors do not halt production to preserve artisanal integrity. They halt shipments because they have not been paid in 90 days. The invoices were piling up, the credit lines were completely maxed out, and the suppliers were finally cutting her off. Graham's carefully constructed reality was equally devastatingly fragile. Curious about his supposed meteoric rise, I spent a quiet Tuesday evening running his name through standard industry employment databases and state licensing registries. The results were aggressively underwhelming. He was not a senior vice president. He was not sitting on the executive board. His actual legally registered title was a regional contract compliance monitor. He was a mid-level, easily replaceable independent contractor whose primary responsibility was ensuring that suburban nursing facilities had correctly filed their basic fire safety inspection forms. He had absolutely zero executive authority, no access to corporate capital, and absolutely no corner office. My parents, entirely blinded by their desperate need to be associated with elite status, aggressively refused to acknowledge any of the glaring warning signs. They could not allow themselves to see the frayed edges of the fantasy because their own social identities were entirely wrapped up in it. They had to believe the lie, because accepting the cold truth meant admitting they had destroyed their relationship with me for absolutely nothing. In their blind, unwavering devotion, they decided to completely double down. Through the digital municipal alerts I had set up years prior, I watched my parents make their most fatal, arrogant mistake yet. Word had filtered through the local business registry that Laurel was planning a massive, wildly expensive physical expansion. She needed immense capital to launch a flagship brick-and-mortar showroom and fund a nationwide marketing campaign to somehow save her drowning brand. Richard and Celeste proudly bragged to their social circle that they had brilliantly put the family legacy to work. They claimed they had authorized a massive, short-term bridge loan to fully fund Laurel's new venture, using Perry Landing as the primary collateral. They spoke loudly about leveraging assets and maximizing equity with the unearned confidence of people who had never actually read a financial penalty clause in their entire lives. When the automated alert from the county clerk's office hit my secure email inbox on a rainy Thursday afternoon, my blood ran completely cold. Perry Landing was legally bound by the ironclad terms of the trust established by my late grandmother. The stipulations were explicitly clear and legally binding any transfer of deed, any collateralization, or any major encumbrance placed against the historic property absolutely required the notarized, physical signatures of both living granddaughters. Laurel could not mortgage that building without my explicit, documented consent, and I had certainly never signed a single piece of paper authorizing them to risk my grandmother's legacy. I logged into the secure municipal database and pulled the heavily encrypted public records for the massive bridge loan. The lender was Crescent Ridge Capital, a notoriously predatory, high-interest private equity firm that specialized in fast cash and brutal, unforgiving foreclosure terms. I scrolled rapidly past the exorbitant interest rates, past the impossible repayment schedules, and went straight to the final page of the notarized collateral agreement. There, sitting in stark black and white ink at the bottom of the legal document, was my own signature. I leaned in extremely close to the glowing monitor, my eyes tracing the familiar sloping curves of the letters. It was a remarkably good forgery, but it was not perfect. The pressure of the pen stroke on the capital letter was completely flat, lacking the natural, dynamic weight of a human hand actively dragging a pen across thick paper. The loop on the final letter was slightly pixelated around the absolute edge. It was not a fresh signature. It was a high-resolution digital scan. I recognized the exact, specific proportions. It was a direct digital lift of the signature from a municipal planning permit I had signed for Harborline Civic Lab almost a decade ago, a specific document that Laurel had easy, unrestricted access to when she was enthusiastically helping me pack my home office during the chaotic weeks before my canceled wedding. My family had not just borrowed heavily against my grandmother's legacy. In their desperate, pathetic scramble to maintain an illusion of wealth, they had actively committed federal wire fraud and felony forgery. They had weaponized my own name to finance their hollow delusions. They had handed the absolute legal rights to the only meaningful piece of my heritage over to a pack of vicious financial wolves, entirely confident that I was too weak, too distant, and too broken to ever find out what they had done. They were incredibly, disastrously wrong. Sitting in my office, staring directly at the concrete, undeniable proof of their ultimate criminality, I did not feel a single ounce of sorrow. I felt the cold, sharp, exhilarating clarity of a loaded weapon clicking perfectly into place. They had spent years building a beautiful, towering house of cards, and they had just willingly handed me the industrial-grade explosive required to level it completely to the ground. The air in the Ashbourne room grew stifling. Laurel was practically glowing with the self-satisfaction of a predator who believed she had successfully cornered her prey. She sat back in her plush velvet chair, waiting for my emotional collapse. She wanted tears. She wanted a screaming match. She wanted the validation of my visible, undeniable jealousy. I offered her none of those things. I simply picked up my heavy linen napkin, folded it perfectly in half, and rested my hands gracefully on the table. When I finally spoke, my voice was entirely devoid of heat. It was the clinical, detached tone of an auditor examining a highly suspicious tax return. "A flagship physical showroom," I began, letting the words hang in the space between us. "A massive brand campaign, and a rooftop gala at Perry Landing with a catering budget in the tens of thousands of dollars. That is a tremendous amount of sudden overhead. Laurel, Traditional banks are notoriously conservative right now regarding lifestyle brands with fluctuating inventory. So, who exactly is the underwriter on this massive venture? Laurel let out a sharp, condescending laugh. She flipped her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder, completely oblivious to the steel trap closing around her ankles. She was entirely too eager to prove she belonged in the big leagues. We do not use traditional, boring commercial banks, Stella, Laurel sneered, swirling the expensive red wine in her crystal glass. We secured a massive, specialized commercial bridge loan through Crescent Ridge Capital. They are an elite private equity firm. They recognized the explosive value of my brand immediately. We used Perry Landing as the primary collateral to secure the funding. Mommy and Daddy entirely agreed. It was the smartest way to leverage our dormant family assets to maximize my brand's global reach. Graham immediately leaned forward, resting his forearms heavily on the mahogany table. He clearly felt the masculine need to dominate the financial conversation and put me firmly in my place. He adjusted his cheap tie, adopting the patronizing, booming voice of a seasoned corporate veteran explaining basic arithmetic to a toddler. It is all about unlocking trapped equity, Stella, Graham declared, gesturing vaguely with his hands. You see, a historic property sitting entirely unencumbered is a dead asset. It is completely useless. In the world of high finance, you have to leverage legacy real estate to generate liquid capital. It is a highly sophisticated financial maneuver. I guided Richard and Celeste through the entire underwriting process myself. I made sure the loan-to-value ratio was completely optimized for Laurel's expansion. I know these complex capital markets can be a little intimidating and confusing for someone outside the corporate development sphere, but it really is just the standard cost of playing the big game. I let him finish his pathetic, buzzword-heavy speech. I let the absolute silence stretch out for 10 full seconds. I watched the arrogant smirk settle onto his face. Then, I dismantled him. That is a truly fascinating perspective on capital markets. Graham, I said evenly, keeping my eyes locked dead onto his. But your brilliant, sophisticated financial maneuver possesses a rather fatal, fundamental flaw regarding the actual collateral. Graham frowned, his thick eyebrows pulling together. Excuse me? I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the terrifying precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. According to the legally binding addendum attached to our late grandmother's final will and testament, Perry Landing was placed into a highly restrictive family trust. The explicit legal language dictates that any transfer of the deed, any commercial mortgage, or any financial encumbrance placed against that specific historic property requires the physical, in-person, fully notarized signatures of both living granddaughters. I paused, letting my gaze drift slowly from Graham to my mother, and finally settling heavily onto my father. I have not visited a notary public in over 4 years. I certainly have not signed a multi-million-dollar commercial loan agreement for Crescent Ridge Capital. So, my question is incredibly simple. Whose signature is on that legal collateral filing? The transformation in the room was instant and physically palpable. The smug, condescending atmosphere evaporated, instantly replaced by the sharp, suffocating stench of pure panic. My father, Richard, suddenly sat entirely rigid in his chair. The color rapidly drained from his flushed cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. My mother, Celeste, abruptly stopped breathing. Her hand, which had been delicately holding her wineglass, began to tremble so violently that a single drop of red liquid splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth like a spot of fresh blood. Richard cleared his throat loudly, a desperate, hollow sound in the quiet room. He forced a tight, entirely unconvincing smile onto his face, attempting to assert his patriarchal authority to smother the sparks before they could ignite. Now, Stella, let us not get bogged down in boring administrative technicalities during a family celebration, my father stammered, his voice noticeably higher and thinner than it had been 5 minutes ago. When we processed the underwriting for the loan, the firm simply utilized the standard general family power of attorney we have kept on file for years. It was just standard legal boilerplate. We simply handled the minor paperwork on your behalf to spare you the unnecessary burden of attending endless meetings. It is absolutely nothing for you to worry your pretty head about." I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the edge of the table. I refused to let him hide behind his patronizing tone. "There is absolutely no active family power of attorney, Dad," I stated, my voice dropping an octave, ringing out with undeniable, lethal authority. "That specific proxy clause was formally and legally dissolved when the trust was officially restructured exactly 7 years ago. The courts entirely invalidated any and all proxy signature rights regarding that specific real estate asset. It is a matter of public legal record." I watched the realization strike them like a physical blow. The absolute certainty in my voice left them absolutely zero room to maneuver. "Which means," I continued, my words slicing cleanly through the heavy silence, "whoever submitted that commercial loan application to Crescent Ridge Capital either utilized outdated, legally voided documents to deceive a major financial institution, or they actively forged my signature on a highly regulated, federally monitored financial instrument." The silence that followed was entirely deafening. Graham suddenly seemed to lose his ability to swallow. His chest hitched. He blindly reached for his water goblet, his hand shaking so severely that when he set the heavy crystal glass back down onto the table, it slammed against the wood with a loud, sharp crack that echoed violently off the paneled walls. He stared at the white tablecloth, entirely unable to look me in the eye. The illusion of the powerful, wealthy executive had completely shattered, leaving behind a terrified, small man who suddenly realized he was standing on the edge of a massive legal cliff. Laurel, however, lacked the basic intelligence to understand the profound legal jeopardy she was currently sitting in. Her fragile ego had been threatened, and her default defense mechanism was blind, screaming rage. Her face contorted into an ugly, vicious sneer, entirely ruining her carefully painted, glamorous facade. "You are absolutely out of your mind," Laurel shrieked, slamming her palm flat against the table, causing the silverware to rattle loudly. "You just cannot stand it, can you? You cannot stand the fact that I am successful and happily married while you are just a miserable, bitter spinster. You came here tonight specifically to ruin my celebration because you are still completely obsessed with my husband. You are still crying over something that happened almost a decade ago, and now you are making up insane, psychotic lies about my business just to get back at me. You are utterly pathetic, Stella." She sat there, chest heaving, breathing heavily through her nose, waiting for me to scream back. She desperately needed me to match her hysterical energy so she could maintain her comfortable narrative that I was simply a jealous, emotionally unstable woman. I did not blink. I did not move a single muscle in my face. I simply looked down at the thick, gold-embossed invitation card resting on the polished wood in front of me, the invitation to her grand, triumphant anniversary gala on the rooftop of my grandmother's building. I reached out and lightly tapped the heavy cardstock with my index finger. I looked up at my sister, my expression entirely calm, entirely resolute, and completely devoid of mercy. "Keep it," I replied, my voice very soft, yet carrying effortlessly across the tense space of the dining room. "In a few days, it might become a souvenir." The suffocating tension inside the private dining area of the Ashbourne room had reached an absolute razor-sharp peak when the heavy brass latch of the oak door finally clicked open. The sound was entirely ordinary, yet in the dead silence of the room, it echoed like the sharp crack of a starter pistol. The general manager of the restaurant stepped into the room first. He was a distinguished older gentleman dressed in a pristine, tailored tuxedo, carrying a silver tray tucked neatly under his left arm. However, his normally passive, deeply accommodating expression had been replaced by a look of tight, uncomfortable, profound seriousness. Right behind him stepped a man who instantly shifted the entire gravitational pull of the room. It was Reed. He was dressed in a dark charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders with flawless, understated precision. He did not wear a flashy, oversized watch like Graham, nor did he puff out his chest in a desperate bid for dominance. Reed possessed the kind of quiet, absolute authority that did not require a booming voice or aggressive posture to demand immediate respect. He radiated a calm, grounded certainty that starkly highlighted the frantic, artificial energy my family had been projecting all evening. My father stopped breathing. My mother lowered her wine glass so slowly it seemed as though she were moving underwater. Laurel simply stared, her mouth slightly parted, entirely unable to compute the sudden intrusion into her carefully orchestrated theater of humiliation. Reed did not spare a single glance for my parents or my sister. He did not look at Graham. He walked with measured, unhurried steps directly across the plush carpet until he reached my side of the table. He stood behind my chair, resting his large, warm hand securely on the velvet backrest right near my shoulder. The physical contact was casual, familiar, and deeply anchoring. He leaned down slightly, catching my eye, and offered a soft, genuine smile that completely ignored the hostility of the surrounding audience. "I apologize for the delay," Reed murmured, his deep voice carrying a natural, unforced warmth. "The traffic coming off the interstate was an absolute nightmare tonight." "You are exactly on time," I replied quietly. Across the table, Laurel looked as though she had been physically struck by a heavy, blunt object. Her entire worldview, a narrative she had painstakingly constructed over the last 9 years, relied entirely on the absolute certainty that I was a lonely, unlovable spinster who spent her evenings crying over the man she had stolen. The undeniable, natural intimacy between Reed and myself was a devastating wrecking ball swinging directly through her glass house. Reed straightened his posture, keeping his hand firmly anchored on my chair. It was the stance of a man entirely accustomed to standing by his partner during the most difficult, high-stakes moments. He finally turned his attention to the rest of the table, his dark eyes sweeping over their shocked faces with a cool, clinical detachment. "Good evening," Reed said, his tone perfectly polite but entirely devoid of any actual friendliness. "For those of you I have not yet had the opportunity to meet, I am Reed Talbot. I am Stella's husband." The word dropped onto the heavy mahogany table like a live grenade. Celeste gasped audibly, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. Richard blinked rapidly, his mind clearly struggling and failing to process the catastrophic revelation. Laurel's face turned an ugly, mottled shade of crimson. She had spent the entire evening mocking me for needing a table for one, absolutely certain of my pathetic isolation. The sudden realization that I had been married, that I had a life entirely separate and hidden from their toxic reach, left her completely speechless. "I am also," Reed continued smoothly, not allowing them a single second to recover from the initial blow, "the co-founder and managing director of Halcyon Redevelopment Partners," before Laurel could formulate a single, coherent shriek of indignation. The restaurant manager cleared his throat softly, stepping forward to the edge of the table. He looked directly at Laurel, his professional demeanor rigidly in place despite the sheer awkwardness of the situation. "Mrs. Holloway, please accept my deepest apologies for the sudden interruption," the manager stated, his voice tight. "I was just contacted by our executive director of off-site catering and special events. I have been instructed to formally inform you that we must immediately halt all culinary preparations and terminate the service contract for your upcoming anniversary gala." Laurel snapped out of her paralyzed state. She bolted upright in her chair, her manicured nails digging fiercely into the white tablecloth. "Excuse me," she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the wood-paneled walls. "You cannot do that. I signed a contract. I paid a massive deposit. Do you have any idea who I am? I will completely ruin this restaurant. I will have your job by tomorrow morning." The manager did not flinch. He simply offered a brief, incredibly stiff bow. "The cancellation has absolutely nothing to do with our restaurant policies, madam. We were informed by the legal receivership that the event cannot proceed because you no longer possess any legal right or physical access to the venue itself." "That is completely insane," Laurel spat, turning her furious glare toward Graham. "Tell him that is insane. Graham, we secured the entire building." Graham opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. He was staring directly at Reed, a sickening, terrifying realization dawning in his pale eyes. Reed reached inside his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a sleek, dark leather folio. He did not toss it aggressively across the table. He placed it down with deliberate, agonizing care, right next to the gold-embossed anniversary invitation Laurel had so arrogantly pushed toward me just 20 minutes prior. Crescent Ridge Capital is a highly aggressive private equity firm, but they are not entirely stupid, Reed explained, his voice entirely calm, delivering a fatal legal diagnosis. When their underwriting department received anonymous, irrefutable documentation highlighting massive, glaring discrepancies in the commercial loan application, specifically regarding the unauthorized collateralization of a restricted family trust and the fraudulent signature of a primary beneficiary, they instantly triggered the acceleration clause. Richard slumped heavily back into his chair, all the artificial, patriarchal bravado draining completely out of his body. He suddenly looked like a very old, very tired, and incredibly foolish man. The loan went into immediate, catastrophic default, Reed continued, tapping his index finger lightly against the leather cover of the folio. Crescent Ridge wanted the highly toxic asset completely off their books before a federal fraud investigation could officially commence. Halcyon Redevelopment Partners specializes in acquiring highly distressed, legally complicated commercial debt. We purchased the defaulted note in its absolute entirety at 7 o'clock this morning. Reed opened the cover of the folio, revealing a thick stack of legal documents stamped with heavy red ink. Which means, Reed said, his gaze locking onto Laurel's horrified face, Halcyon is now the sole legal proprietor of the debt. Here is the formal notice of immediate default. Here is the judicial asset freeze. And here is the court-ordered temporary receivership, granting my firm full, unrestricted, and immediate control over the entire premises of Perry Landing. The locks on the rooftop terrace were changed by our security contractors exactly 2 hours ago. The total destruction of their glittering empire was sitting right there in the center of the dinner table, printed on heavy white legal paper. Laurel's grand, triumphant anniversary gala, the massive flagship showroom, the desperate illusion of immense wealth, it was all completely gone. Seized, frozen, and locked away by the exact woman they had spent a decade trying to convince the world was a failure. Graham let out a high, thin, utterly panicked laugh. It was a pathetic, reedy sound that scraped painfully against the quiet room. He tugged frantically at his shirt collar, sweat suddenly beading heavily on his forehead. "Now hold on a second, buddy," Graham stammered, attempting to use a folksy, relatable tone that failed absolutely spectacularly. He held his hands up in a placating gesture. "Let us not get overly dramatic here. This is clearly just a minor technical error. It is a simple clerical mix-up at the bank regarding the trust parameters. I will just make a few quick phone calls to my senior contacts in the morning, and we will get this little paperwork misunderstanding ironed right out over a cup of coffee." It was a desperate, transparent performance, and absolutely nobody in the room was buying the tickets. For the very first time since the night my engagement imploded 9 years ago, Graham Holloway did not look like a confident, successful man in control of his destiny. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a terrified, fraudulent coward who had just realized he was standing directly on the tracks, staring right into the blinding headlights of a massive, unstoppable freight train. And the absolute best part of the evening was that I did not even have to raise my voice to watch him realize that I was the one driving the engine. Reed did not raise his voice. He simply reached out and flipped to the second tab inside the thick leather folio. The crisp, sharp sound of the heavy legal paper turning was the absolute only noise in the dining room. He smoothed the page flat with his palm, his demeanor entirely clinical, like a seasoned medical examiner preparing to explain the exact cause of a fatal accident. "Let us examine the actual disbursement schedule of the capital," Reed stated, sliding a heavily highlighted, multi-page bank ledger toward the center of the mahogany table. "When a commercial bridge loan of this magnitude is approved, the funds are legally required to be deployed directly into the stated business venture. Laurel claimed this money was for a massive physical expansion and brand marketing. However, forensic accounting is a remarkably unforgiving science. It does not care about your social media aesthetic. Graham suddenly pressed his hands flat against the table, as if trying to push himself up and run, but his legs seemed completely paralyzed. The initial wire transfer, Reed continued, tapping a specific line of numbers with a heavy gold pen, was for $320,000. That money did not go to a commercial real estate broker. It did not go to an inventory supplier. It was funneled directly through a newly formed, anonymous liability company, and then immediately paid out to a third-party, non-union commercial contracting firm. My father, Richard, leaned forward, his forehead deeply creased in profound confusion. A contracting firm, Laurel. What does a lifestyle brand need with a commercial contracting firm? Laurel refused to answer. She was staring at her empty dinner plate, her chest heaving rapidly, looking entirely like a trapped animal. She did not need one, I interjected smoothly, taking over the narrative. I looked directly at my former fiancé. But Graham certainly did. Did you not, Graham? Reed nodded, picking up a separate printed email thread. During the due diligence phase of acquiring this defaulted debt, my team uncovered a massive structural safety violation at a Brightvale senior living facility located just outside the city limits. Graham, acting in his capacity as a regional compliance monitor, had previously authorized incredibly shoddy, unlicensed repair work to cut corners and artificially inflate his quarterly budget margins. 3 weeks ago, a surprise state fire inspection flagged the entire building for immediate evacuation due to those exact corners he cut. The color completely drained from my mother's face. She stared at the man she had proudly paraded as the ideal son-in-law for almost a decade. If that catastrophic violation was officially reported to the Brightvale Executive Board, Reed explained to my horrified parents, Graham would not only be instantly terminated for cause, but he would also face severe civil liability for endangering the residents. He was desperate. He needed a massive influx of untraceable cash to pay an emergency, off-the-books crew to rip out the hazardous materials and rebuild the safety systems before the state inspector returned for the final follow-up. Graham opened his mouth, his lips trembling violently, but he could not form a single defensive word. The truth was sitting right there, heavily documented in black and white. He had not used his brilliant financial acumen to help his wife build an empire. He had used his wife's fraudulent loan, backed by my grandmother's legacy, to frantically bury his own gross professional negligence. He had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars just to keep his flimsy, pathetic corporate costume from ripping at the seams. And what about the rest of the funds? Richard demanded, his voice cracking, completely losing the polished, country club patriarch persona. He looked frantically at Laurel. There was over $500,000 left in that loan. Laurel, tell me you at least secured the flagship property. Reed simply turned to the third tab in the folio. There is no flagship property, Richard, Reed said gently, the absolute lack of malice in his voice making the revelation infinitely more devastating. The Laurel House Living brand is not expanding. It is actively suffocating. The remaining funds were immediately sucked into a frantic, bleeding triage to keep the illusion alive. Reed began dropping individual printed invoices onto the table, one by one, like nails being driven into a coffin. $45,000 paid to a boutique public relations firm to secure fake, highly complimentary profile articles in regional lifestyle magazines. Reed listed $82,000 paid directly to the State Department of Revenue to temporarily halt a criminal prosecution for 3 fiscal quarters of severely delinquent sales taxes that your daughter had been hiding. Another $15,000 for luxury car rentals and private drivers to maintain the appearance of immense wealth. The suppliers, I added, watching Laurel's hands begin to shake. They cut you off entirely 6 months ago. Did they not? You have been living on unpaid consignment goods and fighting off active vendor liens every single morning. Reed produced a set of vibrant, glossy photographs. He placed a printout of Laurel's highly celebrated social media post. the one proudly announcing her grand second location, right next to a printed commercial real estate listing from a local brokerage. "Your spectacular brand expansion," Reed noted, his voice dropping to a quiet, lethal register, "is currently available to rent by the general public for $400 an hour. It is a staging home. And the elite, high-end designer wardrobe you use to project this overwhelming success is provided by a monthly subscription service, an account that is currently severely past due." The absolute silence in the private dining room was suffocating, the sheer staggering weight of the deception pressed down on the entire family. Richard and Celeste Perry sat completely frozen, staring at the scattered documents, the fake photographs, and the damning bank ledgers. They were finally forced to confront the horrifying reality of their choices. They had not invested in a thriving, brilliant entrepreneur. They had not backed the winning horse. They had taken the only real, tangible piece of wealth our family possessed, the multi-million-dollar historic building my grandmother had left behind, and they had gambled it all away to fund a luxurious, desperately pathetic theatrical production. They had financed a cover-up for a failing compliance monitor and a massive, hollow photo shoot for a bankrupt influencer. Graham, sweating profusely and breathing in sharp, shallow gasps, suddenly slammed his fist onto the table in a final, agonizing display of false bravado. "This is completely ridiculous," Graham shouted, his voice cracking horribly. "It does not matter what the initial allocations were. We have enormous earning potential. I am next in line for the regional vice president chair at Brightvale. My new salary alone will easily cover the monthly premiums on the Crescent Ridge note. I will pay the entire thing back by the end of the fiscal year." I actually felt a brief, fleeting flicker of genuine pity for him, simply because he had absolutely no idea how thoroughly Reed had dismantled his life. Reed did not even bother to pull out another document. He simply looked at Graham with an expression of profound, weary disgust. "There is no promotion, Graham," Reed said softly. "While conducting the legal transfer of the commercial debt, my firm was legally required to verify the employment status and executive income of all primary guarantors. I personally spoke with the regional director of human resources at Brightvale on Wednesday afternoon." Graham went entirely still. The erratic, panicked movement of his eyes stopped dead. "Your employment contract was officially terminated for cause exactly 72 hours ago," Reed stated, delivering the final, fatal blow. "The state fire inspector noticed the rushed, off-the-books repairs during his follow-up visit and immediately alerted your corporate office. You are entirely unemployed. You have been pretending to go to work for the last 3 days. You have absolutely zero income. You are facing a massive corporate lawsuit for unauthorized construction, and you are entirely unhireable in the healthcare sector." The room completely collapsed inward. Graham buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, muffled sob of absolute defeat. Richard stared blankly at the wall, looking completely hollowed out, entirely destroyed by the realization that his pristine reputation was about to be publicly obliterated. Celeste began to weep quietly, her mascara running down her cheeks, mourning the loss of the wealth she had so desperately craved. And then, Laurel finally snapped. The weight of the absolute truth was entirely too heavy for her fragile, synthetic ego to bear. She leaped up from her chair, her rented emerald gown knocking over her crystal water glass. The cold water spilled across the table, soaking into the pristine white linen, completely ignored by everyone. "You planned this!" Laurel screamed at the top of her lungs, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You completely orchestrated this entire thing, you psychotic, jealous bitch. You spent 9 years obsessing over me, digging through my life, waiting for one tiny mistake so you could swoop in and ruin my marriage. You did all of this just to get revenge because you were never good enough for him." She was panting heavily, her eyes wild and frantic, desperately trying to force the blame back onto me. She needed me to be the villain. She needed this to be a malicious conspiracy, so she would not have to face the fact that she had destroyed her own life through sheer, arrogant incompetence. I did not stand up. I did not match her screaming. I sat perfectly still, surrounded by the absolute wreckage of the Perry family legacy. I looked up at my older sister, feeling absolutely nothing but a deep, profound emptiness where my anger used to be. "No, Laurel," I replied, my voice cold, steady, and terrifyingly calm. "I did not plan your failure. I just prepared for the day the truth came looking for you." The illusion of family unity disintegrated in a matter of seconds. When the absolute, inescapable reality of their financial ruin finally settled over the private dining room, the Perrys did not band together to face the storm. They did not offer each other comfort or solidarity. Instead, they immediately turned on each other with the vicious, unhesitating brutality of cornered animals. My father was the very first to draw blood. Richard surged up from his chair, his face a terrifying mask of deep purple rage. He pointed a trembling, accusing finger directly at Graham, completely abandoning the polished, country club patriarch persona he had carefully cultivated for decades. "You absolute, parasitic fraud," Richard hissed, his voice vibrating with explosive hatred. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. "You sat in my living room, drinking my expensive scotch, and you convinced me to risk my family legacy. You told me you had the financial acumen to protect us. You dragged my entire family down into the dirt, just to cover up your own pathetic incompetence at a mid-level management job. You are nothing but a cheap con man." Graham shrank back into his seat, raising his hands defensively as if he expected my father to physically strike him. But before Graham could formulate a single excuse, the sound of ragged, heavy sobbing filled the room. My mother, Celeste, had buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. However, as I watched her weep, I felt absolutely no sympathy. I knew my mother better than anyone. Her profound panic did not stem from the horrifying realization that she had deeply wronged me, or that she had mortgaged my grandmother's legacy through fraudulent means. She was not crying for her daughters. She was mourning the sudden, violent death of her own social status. "The country club," Celeste wailed softly, her voice muffled by her trembling fingers. She lowered her hands, her carefully applied makeup entirely ruined, her eyes wide with a terrifying hollow dread. "The charity board of directors, our friends, everyone in Atlanta is going to read about this in the public foreclosure notices. How will we ever show our faces in public again? We are entirely ruined. Richard, we have absolutely nothing left to our name." Sensing the rapidly shifting tide, Laurel instinctively knew she had to secure a lifeboat before the ship completely sank. She wiped her own tears away and turned her furious glare onto the man she had stolen from me 9 years ago. "It was him!" Laurel shrieked, desperately throwing her husband directly under the bus to save her own fragile victim narrative. "I am just a creative director. I am an artist. I trusted my husband to handle the complex financial logistics of the brand expansion. He told me the bridge loan was perfectly legal and standard procedure. I had absolutely no idea he was funneling the capital to fix his own illegal construction mistakes. He lied to me. Mom. He completely manipulated me." The sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of her statement hung heavily in the air. The fiercely independent, incredibly successful female entrepreneur had instantly dissolved into a helpless, naive housewife the very second the consequences arrived. Graham's head snapped toward Laurel, his eyes widening in absolute disbelief at the sudden betrayal. Cornered by his father-in-law, openly discarded by his wife, and entirely stripped of his corporate armor, Graham resorted to the absolute last, desperate weapon of a terrified coward: empty, aggressive legal threats. He slammed his hands flat against the table and glared at me, his face twisting into an ugly, desperate sneer. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Stella," Graham spat, entirely abandoning his folksy charm. "But this is blatant, malicious, tortious interference. You used your new husband and his massive corporate bank account to orchestrate a personal vendetta against me. You are deliberately destroying my professional reputation just because you are still bitter that I chose Laurel over you. I will hire the most aggressive litigation firm in the state. I will sue you both for defamation and punitive damages. I will drag your little redevelopment company through years of agonizing legal discovery." The threat echoed loudly in the room, but it held absolutely zero weight. Reed did not even blink. He did not shift his posture. He looked at Graham with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing a deeply flawed specimen. "In order to successfully sue for defamation, Graham, the statements in question must be demonstrably false," Reed replied, his voice chillingly calm and entirely devoid of any intimidation. "Every single number, every single contract clause, and every single digital timestamp in this legal folio has been thoroughly verified by an independent team of forensic auditors and a federal bankruptcy judge. This is no longer a trivial family squabble over a dinner table. You committed federal wire fraud across state lines. You utilized a forged signature to secure commercial funding. When the district attorney inevitably subpoenas these records, my firm will hand them over with absolute pleasure. If you attempt to initiate a civil lawsuit against my wife or my company, you will not just bankrupt yourself in legal fees, you will vastly accelerate your own criminal indictment." Graham's mouth opened and closed silently, like a suffocating fish. The absolute, unyielding wall of legal reality Reed presented finally crushed the last remaining ounce of fight out of him. He slumped back into his chair, staring blankly at the ceiling, utterly defeated, seeing that intimidation and anger had failed spectacularly. My father instinctively pivoted to his secondary survival tactic. It was a maneuver I had seen him execute flawlessly 100 times in business, but never directed at me. He desperately tried to align himself with the person holding all the power. Richard smoothed his tie, took a deep, shaky breath, and turned his attention back to me. His eyes were suddenly wide, earnest, and completely devoid of the condescension he had displayed just an hour ago. "Stella, sweetheart," Richard began, his voice dropping into a soft, pleading register. He actually attempted a tight, affectionate smile. "You must know that your mother and I were completely blinded by Graham's lies. We had absolutely no idea the extent of his deception. But you always were the smart daughter. You always had an incredible, sharp head for complex business matters. You saw right through him when we could not." He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, attempting to project a sense of unified family partnership. "Listen to me, darling. We can entirely fix this. We can keep this massive misunderstanding out of the public courts. If your company simply restructures the debt internally, we can quietly liquidate Graham's assets. We can sell off Laurel's remaining inventory, and we can quietly handle this as a private family matter. We are blood. Stella. We should have trusted your judgment from the very beginning. Please, you have to help us protect the family name." I sat perfectly still, letting his desperate, hollow words wash over me. Suddenly, the extravagant surroundings of the restaurant faded away. I was no longer sitting in the Ashbourne room. In my mind, I was suddenly 25 years old again, standing in my parents' sunlit living room, clutching the printed emails that proved my entire future had just been destroyed by my own sister. I remembered the agonizing, physical pain in my chest. I remembered desperately looking at my mother, begging for just a fraction of maternal protection. I remembered exactly what Celeste had said to me that day. I took a slow, deep breath, anchoring myself back into the present moment. I looked directly into my mother's tear-streaked face, and then shifted my gaze to my father's pleading eyes. 9 years ago, I said, my voice steady, quiet, and completely devoid of the warmth my father was so desperately trying to mine. I stood in your house, completely shattered. I had just lost the man I loved and the sister I trusted in a single afternoon. I looked to you for help. And do you remember what you told me? Mom? Celeste flinched visibly, her eyes darting away from mine, completely unable to hold my gaze. You told me that the weak should never expect other people to make room for them, I recited, the words completely stripped of their old poison, reduced now to mere historical fact. You told me that I was simply too cold, and that I needed to accept reality without making a dramatic scene. I leaned forward slightly, closing the physical distance between us, ensuring that every single word I spoke landed with absolute surgical precision. "You do not love your children unconditionally," I stated, staring right through their fragile, terrified facades. "You never have. You only love the child who makes you look more successful, more wealthy, and more glamorous in front of the world. For 9 years, you allowed Laurel to treat my humiliation as a punchline because she provided you with the beautiful, perfect illusion you craved. And now that her illusion has completely collapsed, you are desperately trying to drag me back in, not because you love me, but because I am the one holding the keys to the vault." Richard opened his mouth to protest, a weak sound escaping his throat, but I raised a single hand, stopping him instantly. "You do not get to call me sweetheart," I continued, the absolute freezing temperature of my voice dropping the room by 10 degrees. "You do not get to claim we are a unified family. And you certainly do not get to ask me to protect a legacy that you willingly handed over to criminals just to fund a lie." I did not need to scream. I did not need to throw a glass or pound my fists on the table. The profound, unshakable coldness in my voice was the exact calculated price of 9 years spent quietly surviving in the dark while they danced in the light. I had allowed them to view me as the destined loser for almost a decade, and in doing so, I had learned exactly how to win. The silence that followed my declaration was thick and suffocating. My parents stared at me with wide, uncomprehending eyes, their minds desperately trying to map this new, terrifying landscape where I held absolute control. In their shallow, profoundly transactional worldview, power was only ever used for one specific purpose: to crush your enemies and parade your wealth. Laurel finally found her voice again, though it was nothing more than a ragged, venomous hiss. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles completely white. "You are just going to sell it off, are not you?" Laurel sneered, her eyes darting between Reed and me. "You bought the defaulted debt just so you could liquidate the property and pocket the cash. You are going to gut the interior, tear down the historic facade, and sell the land to some soulless corporate developer who wants to build another ugly, towering glass condominium complex for billionaires. You are going to destroy our heritage just to add a few extra zeros to your bank account and prove you finally beat me." It was a remarkably revealing accusation. Laurel could only imagine me behaving exactly the way she would behave if she were holding the winning hand. Reed did not even bother to look at her. He remained standing behind my chair, his presence a steady, unyielding anchor in the chaotic room. "Halcyon Redevelopment Partners is not a predatory private equity firm," Reed stated, his deep voice slicing effortlessly through Laurel's frantic projecting. "We do not specialize in displacing communities to build luxury high-rises. We specialize in acquiring toxic, mismanaged assets and fundamentally repurposing them into facilities that actually serve a vital, tangible purpose." I reached down into my leather briefcase resting on the carpeted floor beneath my chair. I pulled out a thick, beautifully bound architectural presentation folder and laid it gently onto the table, right over the scattered, incriminating bank ledgers and the fake social media photographs. I flipped the heavy cover open. Inside was a detailed, meticulously drafted rendering of Perry Landing. The historic red brick exterior remained entirely intact, restored to its original breathtaking glory. But the interior floor plans had been completely transformed. "When Crescent Ridge Capital officially approved the transfer of the deed," I explained, tracing my finger over the vibrant architectural blueprints, "I immediately filed the municipal zoning permits to convert the entire property. We are not building luxury condominiums. We are actively transforming Perry Landing into a comprehensive, fully funded operational facility called the June Perry House." The name hung in the chilled air of the dining room, striking an incredibly deep, resonant chord. My grandmother, June Perry, had been the absolute antithesis of my parents. She had possessed an inherent, quiet dignity that did not rely on expensive jewelry or country club memberships. She was the absolute only person in my entire bloodline who had ever looked at me and recognized my inherent value without demanding that I perform a specific, shiny role to earn her affection. When I was a little girl, she used to tell me that a strong foundation was the only thing that actually mattered, both in buildings and in people. The June Perry House will operate as a dedicated rehabilitation and vocational training center, I continued, my voice steady and imbued with a quiet, fierce pride. It is specifically designed for women who are actively trying to rebuild their lives from absolute zero, women who have experienced profound financial ruin, catastrophic personal betrayals, or the sudden, devastating loss of their homes. We are providing temporary housing on the upper floors, extensive job placement programs on the ground level, and comprehensive financial literacy counseling in the administrative wing. It will be a sanctuary for people who genuinely need a second chance to construct a sustainable future. Laurel stared at the blueprints, her face contorting into an expression of absolute horrified revulsion. The staggering irony of the situation was physically breaking her brain. The magnificent, historic building she had arrogantly claimed as the glamorous, elite backdrop for her fake lifestyle brand, the rooftop she wanted to use to prove her ultimate supremacy over me, was going to be entirely stripped of its exclusivity. It was going to become a functional, working haven for the broken, the displaced, and the betrayed. "You cannot do this," Laurel whispered, her voice cracking with genuine, unadulterated despair. "You are going to turn a premier downtown real estate asset into a charity clinic. You are going to fill our beautiful building with bankrupt losers. You are completely destroying the property value. You are destroying my entire brand aesthetic." She was entirely incapable of understanding that her brand aesthetic was nothing but a hollow, rotting lie. Richard dragged his hands down his face, looking suddenly extremely frail and ancient. The polished veneer of the successful patriarch had entirely dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, defeated man. He looked at me, his eyes brimming with a pathetic, desperate sorrow. "Stella," Richard rasped, his voice trembling uncontrollably, "are you truly going to take that place away from the family? That building is the absolute last piece of our legacy. It is all we have left to our name. You cannot simply steal it from us." I looked at my father, feeling a profound, heavy sadness, not for the man sitting in front of me, but for the father I had once foolishly believed I had. "I am not stealing anything, Dad," I replied, my tone completely calm and entirely devoid of vindictiveness. "I am simply taking over the management of an asset you willingly abandoned. You completely lost the right to call that building a family legacy the exact moment you weaponized it against me. You used a forged document to mortgage my grandmother's memory just to fund a fraudulent, empty charade. You did not protect the legacy. You actively destroyed it. I am simply the person stepping in to clean up the wreckage." At the opposite end of the table, Celeste finally broke completely. She abandoned all pretense of upper-class dignity. She slumped forward, resting her head in her hands, openly sobbing into the ruined white tablecloth. "Please, Stella," my mother begged, her voice thick and wet with tears. "Please just stop the receivership. Do not take the building away. We just need a little more time. Give us 6 months. Give us 3 months. We can fix this. We can find a new investor. We can make the payments. Please, darling, do not completely ruin us." It was the most agonizing, pathetic display of manipulation I had ever witnessed. She was using the exact same affectionate terms she had weaponized against me my entire life, desperately hoping that the deep, ingrained childhood instinct to please my mother would somehow override my rational mind. But that scared, desperate little girl had died 9 years ago in their sunlit living room. "I cannot save you from the consequences of your own actions. Mom," I said softly, the absolute finality in my voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. "The debt is called. The legal foreclosure is already in motion. You cannot fix a massive structural collapse with a fresh coat of expensive paint." I slowly closed the architectural presentation folder, the heavy cardboard cover landing with a soft, definitive thud. I looked around the table, meeting each of their eyes one final time. However, I continued, shifting my posture slightly, I am going to offer you one final concession, a courtesy that you absolutely do not deserve, but one that I am choosing to extend simply because I refuse to operate the way you do. The entire room went dead silent. Even Laurel stopped her frantic breathing, waiting desperately for a lifeline. If you cooperate entirely with the federal forensic audit, I outlined, my terms sharp and unyielding as polished diamond. If you vacate the premises of Perry Landing within 48 hours without initiating a single frivolous legal injunction, and if you completely cease using my name, or the legacy of my grandmother, to manipulate your way out of your financial responsibilities, I will instruct my legal team to handle the property transfer entirely behind closed doors. I paused, ensuring they fully grasped the magnitude of the offer. I will not proactively leak the sordid, humiliating details of your massive commercial fraud to the local press, I promised quietly. I will not call the country club board of directors to explain why you are suddenly liquidating your assets. You will lose the building, and you will lose your fake empires, but I will allow you to keep whatever fragile, pathetic shreds of your public dignity you can manage to scrape together. The conditional kindness landed like a physical blow. It hurt them far more deeply than any screaming match or vindictive threat ever could have. Because in that exact moment, looking at the calm, unbothered expression on my face, they finally realized the absolute, devastating truth. They had spent almost a decade convincing themselves that I was weak, that I was easily broken, and that I was the designated loser of the family. But I was not weak at all. I possessed the absolute power to completely annihilate them publicly, to drag their names through the mud, just as they had done to me. I simply chose not to, because I did not need their destruction to validate my own existence. I did not want to be anything like them. Reed reached into the deep inside pocket of his charcoal suit jacket one final time. He did not pull out another foreclosure notice or a damning bank ledger. Instead, he produced a heavy, beautifully textured envelope made of thick ivory paper. He leaned forward across the mahogany table and placed it with deliberate, agonizing care directly on top of the gold-embossed anniversary invitation Laurel had so arrogantly shoved toward me at the very beginning of the dinner. The contrast between the two pieces of stationery was stark. Laurel's invitation was shiny, loud, and desperate for attention. The envelope Reed laid down was understated, elegant, and carried the quiet weight of absolute permanence. Inside that envelope, Reed stated, his voice a steady rumble in the completely silent room, is the official invitation for the inaugural sponsor launch and foundational dedication of the June Perry House. We are hosting the City Council, the Municipal Grant Committee, and several major philanthropic donors. Laurel stared at the ivory envelope as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. Her hands trembled so violently she had to grip the edge of the table again to steady herself. The date of the dedication ceremony, Reed continued, perfectly relentless in his calm delivery, is scheduled for exactly 3 weeks from tonight. It will take place on the fully renovated rooftop terrace of the building. The realization hit Laurel like a physical blow to the chest. It was the exact same day. The exact same evening she had planned to host her lavish, fake anniversary gala. The night she had desperately intended to use as her ultimate stage to prove to the entire world, and especially to me, that she had won the grand prize 9 years ago. Instead, that specific date would now mark the exact moment I opened the doors to a real, tangible, profoundly useful sanctuary built directly on top of the ruined ashes of her deceit. Her day of supreme vanity had just been entirely overwritten by my day of actual, meaningful purpose. Next to her, Graham looked like a man who had completely dissociated from his own body. Reed slid one final, single sheet of legal paper across the table toward him. It was a formal notice of indemnification and a complete severance of all financial liabilities. "Sign that," Reed instructed quietly. "It officially removes my wife and her corporate entities from any lingering, toxic financial blowback regarding your unauthorized construction penalties at Brightvale. If you sign it right now, Halcyon Redevelopment Partners will not actively pursue civil damages against you for the fraudulent collateralization. You will still have to face the federal bankruptcy courts and the state investigators entirely on your own, but we will not add our corporate litigators to your firing squad. All of Graham's arrogant, booming corporate bravado had completely dissolved. He did not argue. He did not offer another pathetic, folksy excuse or issue a single hollow legal threat. He simply reached out with a violently shaking hand, clicked his cheap pen, and signed his name on the dotted line. He looked entirely broken, reduced to nothing more than a terrified, unemployed fraud facing a very public, very brutal reality. My parents sat frozen at the head of the table. They were staring at the absolute destruction of their meticulously curated social empire. The country club memberships, the charity galas, the wealthy friends, all of it was going to vanish the second the public foreclosure notices hit the local newspapers. Richard looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading, desperately trying to summon the old patriarchal authority he used to wield so effortlessly over my life. "Stella, please," my father whispered, his voice cracking horribly. "You cannot just walk away and leave us like this. We are your family. We are your blood. You have to reconsider this. Think about your family." I looked at him, feeling a strange, profound sense of peace settling over my heart. For almost 3 decades, those exact words had been the heavy chains they used to control me. Think about the family. It was the phrase they used to demand my silent compliance when Laurel stole my fiancé. It was the phrase they used to justify rewriting history to make me the villain. But sitting here tonight, looking at the terrified, shallow people across the table, I realized those words held absolutely zero power over me anymore. The chains were gone. I reached across the table and picked up Laurel's gaudy, gold-embossed anniversary invitation. I held it in my hand for a long moment, feeling the cheap, heavy cardstock between my fingers. I looked right into my older sister's panicked, tear-filled eyes. I did not feel a single ounce of hatred or jealousy. I just felt completely, wonderfully free. I slowly lowered her card and placed it gently right next to the ivory invitation for the June Perry house. "Earlier tonight," I said, my voice incredibly soft, but carrying an undeniable, absolute finality, "you told me that I needed to find another table. You told me I needed to get used to sitting alone. But you do not understand. Laurel, I am not looking for a seat at your table anymore. I built the entire room." That single sentence severed the invisible, suffocating hierarchy that had crushed me for nearly a decade. I was no longer the discarded sister begging for scraps of affection. I was no longer the bitter loser waiting for an apology that would never arrive. I had completely outgrown the small, toxic world they occupied. I had created a vast, beautiful space of my own, and they simply were not invited inside. Reed stepped back from my chair. He did not offer them a smug smile or a parting insult. He possessed the kind of authentic, grounded power that completely negated the need for theatrical gloating. He simply turned around, walked over to the restaurant manager who was standing quietly by the door, and handed him a sleek, black corporate credit card. "Please process the bill for the entire evening, including the canceled preparations for the future event," Reed told the manager, his tone polite and thoroughly respectful. "And please ensure a 30% gratuity is added for the waitstaff who had to navigate this incredibly tense room tonight. I deeply appreciate your utmost professionalism." The manager bowed deeply, clearly immensely relieved, and stepped out into the hallway to run the transaction. Reed's quiet, unpretentious courtesy highlighted the absolute, staggering gap between actual, secure wealth and the frantic, screaming desperation of Laurel's fake luxury. I stood up from my chair. I smoothed the fabric of my skirt, picked up my leather briefcase, and turned my back on the Perry family. Laurel was crying hysterically now, her head buried in her arms. Graham was staring blankly at the wall. My parents were sitting in stunned, horrified silence, watching their only reliable lifeline walk away from them forever. I walked toward the heavy oak door where my husband was waiting for me. Reed offered me his arm, a warm, reassuring smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. I slipped my hand through his, feeling the solid, unshakable strength of the life we had built together. We walked out of the private dining room and into the softly lit hallway of the Ashbourne room. I did not look back, not even once. The true climax of this entire 9-year journey was not watching their fraudulent empire collapse into dust. It was not the brilliant legal trap or the stunning financial takeover. The real victory, the profound, healing triumph that settled deep into my bones as I walked out into the warm Atlanta night, was the absolute certainty that for the very first time in my entire life, I no longer needed them to see my value. I knew exactly what I was worth, and that was finally more than enough. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. Do not forget to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.